If you've ever sat at a crowded table and felt completely alone, you already know where my story begins. With a plate left empty and a room full of people pretending not to notice. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell me where you're listening from in the comments. What would you do in my place? I am Elana, 34, and until that night I believed I understood the difference between small humiliations and life-changing ones. I was wrong. There were 23 of us at Margaret's table. Gleaming silver, ironed linen, cards with our names written in the careful script of someone who plans impressions the way other people plan meals. The servers moved in like choreography, plates whispering down on wood, forks glinting, steam rising from buttered steaks. A hush swept the room, the collective intake of breath before the first bite. Except in front of me. In front of me, nothing. Silence is not quiet. Silence in a room like that is a sound that presses into your ribs. My chair felt suddenly small, my napkin too white on my lap, my name card, Elana, like a label no one had ordered. Beside me, Daniel reached for his water, looked at me, then at my empty setting as if he'd discovered a typo in a book he couldn't correct. Aunt Clara noticed first. Clara has the kind of eyes that miss nothing and forgive a lot. "Excuse me," she said, gentle but clear, tilting her head toward my plate. "I think we're one short?" The servers froze. The room's elegant hum thinned into a brittle wire. At the head of the table, Margaret rested her fingertips on the table edge, as if it were an instrument she alone could play. Her smile barely moved, as if it cost her something she could easily afford. "No, we're not," she said. "Elana knows why. He knows why." The words slid into the space where my dinner should have been, set themselves down and made a home. Every conversation stranded itself on them. Even the candles seemed to pause, their flames narrowing, listening. I tasted metal in my mouth. I began, but Daniel's hand found my wrist under the table, the universal signal for not here, not now. I felt the tremor in his fingers. Was it fear of me speaking or of his mother? "I'll ask the kitchen," a server blurted, flustered, and started to move. Margaret's voice, a soft touch of velvet that still found the throat, stopped him. "Let's not fuss," she said. "In this family, respect is served to those who deserve it." A soft laugh, someone's nervous tick, shattered the stillness, and then the clink of knives resumed, the polite murder of steak. 22 people performed the ritual of looking anywhere but at me. If shame had a temperature, the room was fevered. It didn't start there, of course. Humiliations like this are never a beginning, they are a harvest. For 2 years I had planted goodwill in Margaret's soil. I learned her recipes, complimented her roses, sent reminders for dental checkups because she liked efficiency. "We are not children who forget important things," she'd say. When she hosted, I came early to iron napkins. When she criticized, I thanked her for her honesty, then did better the next time. I told myself bridges are built from both sides and I didn't mind carrying extra wood. But bridges can also be drawbridges, and Margaret's was up more often than not. "Maybe it's a mistake," Daniel whispered now, eyes fixed on a place in the middle distance where men often stare when the women they love and the women who raised them collide. "Don't," I whispered back. "Don't make this smaller than it is. Don't make me invisible with good intentions." Across from me, Clara set down her fork with deliberate care. "Margaret," she said, "we don't do this. Not in this family." The room stiffened. Challenging Margaret in her house was like opening a window during a storm and asking the curtains to behave. Margaret turned to Clara with a look she kept for children and debtors. "We do exactly what we do," she said. "Pass the asparagus, please." And there it was, the verdict wrapped in etiquette. I remembered the first time I met Margaret. She had looked at me, my thrifted dress, my too honest smile, and said, "You're thoughtful, I'll give you that," in a tone that meant you can keep it. I had thought then that time would soften edges. I didn't understand that some edges are there by design, kept sharp to draw just enough blood to keep you careful. The server returned, pale, with a plate. He placed it in front of me with a hand that trembled. Steam gathered in a pleading cloud. I stared at it. Of course I could have picked up my knife. Of course I could have eaten. But hunger is not always for food. The first bite I knew would taste like surrender. "Looks delicious," Daniel said, and the desperation in his cheerfulness made something in me lean away. He had once told me he loved me because I was steady. I wondered if he meant steady like a lighthouse or steady like a doormat. "Thank you," I told the server. He blinked twice, relieved, as if I'd absolved him personally. The The conversation found its gasps of normalcy again. Promotions, schools, vacations so similar they might have been copied from the same brochure. Margaret asked after people's flights, their renovations, their charities. Her voice warmed for stories that affirmed her worldview. Orderly, inherited, owing. When it came near me it cooled like a draft. I imagined picking up my plate and walking it to the kitchen, asking for a different meal entirely. One with respect as the main course. I imagined standing and saying, "I do know why," and cataloging the small cruelties that had become a language between us. The forgetting to include me in photos, the invitations sent to Daniel that arrived as afterthoughts to me, the gifts labeled to my husband alone when we both hosted. I imagined saying it so clearly that every fork in the room stilled again, but this time for truth. Instead I cut the steak. The knife slid through, the meat yielded. I chewed and the table's noise came back, and I tucked my hurt into the quiet place in me where I kept things I couldn't fix yet. When dessert came, tarts shiny as lacquer, meringue like small clouds, my plate was again bare. No pastry. No fruit. Just the reflection of the chandelier in white porcelain, a constellation of light I couldn't swallow. "Elana," Clara said softly. "Do you want some of mine?" "I'm fine," I said. I was not fine. Fine is what you say when the truth would be too hungry for the room. Across the table, a cousin asked Margaret about the annual foundation gala. "We're expanding our scholarship list this year," Margaret said, magnanimity settling over her like a cashmere shawl. "It's important to reward merit. Merit. Served to those who deserve it." I looked down at my second empty plate and understood what she had built. A theater where she could perform generosity while rationing dignity. A room where she could feed everyone and starve one person on purpose and call it housekeeping. The evening stretched. Coffee. Stories. A toast to tradition. The words about family were large and soft like pillows. I kept sinking into them and finding the hard places beneath. Daniel squeezed my hand now and then, a question he never asked out loud. Each time I returned the squeeze, a temporary truce. When it was over, cars pulled up like reliable friends. Coats were shrugged on. Air rushed in from the winter night, cold and honest. At the door, Margaret kissed cheeks, dispensed advice as if it were candy, accepted thanks as if they were taxes. When it was my turn, she assessed me the way jewelers look at stones. "Drive safe," she said, and then lower, for me alone. "Some seats are privileges, not rights. Remember that." I nodded because nodding is a language too. Then I stepped outside, and the cold met me with a sincerity I had missed all evening. Breath clouded the air, my own ghost floating briefly in front of me before vanishing. In the car, Daniel started the engine but not the conversation. The dash lights painted his face in pale blues. "I'll talk to her," he said finally. "She shouldn't have." "She did," I said. "And she meant it." He gripped the wheel. "She gets old-fashioned about things. She thinks respect is earned." "I've been earning for 2 years," I said. "Maybe the currency is wrong." We drove. The city slid by, windows lit like small, stubborn hopes. At a red light, Daniel turned to me. "Elana, I'm sorry." The apology hung there between us, warm and insufficient. "Are you sorry it happened?" I asked. "Or sorry you didn't stop it?" He looked back at the light. It changed. He drove. I didn't cry. This surprises people when I tell them. They expect tears in a story like this, as if moisture were proof of injury. But sometimes the body stores what the heart refuses to spill. Instead, I went home and did the thing I do when the world feels misaligned. I made tea. I measured, I poured, I waited. Ordinary rituals remind you that heat becomes strength if you give it time. At the kitchen table, I laid out a napkin and set my cup on it. A plate too, empty on purpose. I stared at it. Felt its weight without weight. Object, symbol, verdict. Then I reached into the drawer, took out a pen and wrote 2 words on the napkin. 2 words that would become my compass. Be patient. People think patience is passive. They confuse stillness with surrender. But patience is the planning room of dignity. It's where you map the exits, count the seats, choose your moment. From down the hall, I heard Daniel moving, the nervous pacing of a man trying to arrange furniture in a house that's on fire. I let him pace. I let the tea steep. I let the hurt concentrate until it wasn't a fog anymore but a fine point. My phone buzzed. A message from Clara. I saw what she did. "I am sorry. If you need me, I'm here. P.S. The lemon tarts were overrated." A smile broke through, small but real. I typed back, thank you. Okay. For now. Then after a breath I added, next time I won't be the only one without a plate. I didn't know exactly what that meant yet. Only that the story would not end in someone else's dining room. Only that the balance had shifted even if no one but me could feel the floor tilt. When I finally lay down, sleep came like a negotiation. My mind replayed the moment again. The way Margaret's smile had clipped the air, the way the room had colluded with its silence, the way I had learned which kind of hunger I could live with. In the darkness I whispered the other words she'd given me, tasting them until they lost their power. He knows why. By morning I did. When people talk about humiliation they picture tears, maybe shouting, maybe storming out. But humiliation can also sit quietly, straight-backed at the table with a smile fixed like wallpaper. That was me. I didn't walk out of Margaret's dining room. I stayed until the last goodbye, until the last air kiss brushed my cheek. I stayed because leaving would have given her exactly what she wanted. Spectacle. But later, in the smallness of our own apartment, the silence spread differently. It wasn't theatrical anymore. It was intimate, almost suffocating. Daniel sat at the edge of our bed like a schoolboy after detention. His words came hesitant, broken into fragments. She didn't mean it like that. She's just traditional. You know, she respects you in her own way. Each sentence landed like ash, gray, weightless, useless. I looked at him, really looked. The man I had chosen, the man I loved, reduced to a boy caught between two loyalties. His shoulders curled inward, his eyes searching for an exit that didn't exist. He wanted me to forgive and forget so he wouldn't have to choose. But choices happen even in silence. His was already made. You did nothing, I told him, my voice even. That was your choice. He didn't argue. He just pressed his palms to his face and breathed into them like a man trying to hold his soul together. The days that followed were quieter than usual. Margaret had planted her cruelty in me and it grew like ivy in the cracks. At work I smiled at clients, led meetings, signed contracts. But the whole time my chest carried the weight of that empty plate. It wasn't just food I'd been denied. It was recognition, belonging, respect. Every lunch break I replayed it. The thin smile, the words, Elana knows why. I examined them like shards of glass, cutting my thoughts again and again. What had I done to deserve that performance? Was it because I wasn't born into their kind of family? Because my parents hadn't left me summer homes or heirlooms to polish? Because I was a woman who had built her own life brick by brick instead of inheriting a castle? Or was it simpler? Was it because I had married her son, taking him farther away from her orbit than she could bear? The questions circled, but the answer never came. Some truths aren't puzzles to be solved. They're weapons to be wielded. Margaret hadn't acted out of confusion. She had acted with precision. One evening Claire called me. She didn't skirt around it. I saw your face, Elana. I've seen that face before, just not on you. She's done it to others. Little humiliations. Small tests. You're not the first. Her voice was warm, steady, and it cut through my isolation like a lantern in fog. Why doesn't anyone stop her? I asked. There was a pause on the line. Because no one wants to be next. That sentence chilled me more than anything Margaret had done. An entire family bent under one woman's quiet cruelty. Respect wasn't given, it was extorted. Fear kept her throne polished. But you said something, I reminded her. Yes, Clara said simply. And that's why she doesn't like me much either. I smiled despite myself. In that moment I knew I wasn't entirely alone. At night, Daniel would roll over and whisper apologies. They piled up between us like stones. Sometimes he promised to talk to her. Sometimes he promised it wouldn't happen again. But promises are air. And air cannot feed a starving soul. One night I whispered back, I don't need her to like me. I need her to stop trying to erase me. Daniel didn't reply. His breathing slowed into the rhythm of sleep, leaving me awake with my own heartbeat pounding too loud for comfort. Weeks passed. Invitations came and went. Family brunches, charity galas, gatherings where Margaret's name was embossed on the invitations like a brand. I declined most of them. I told Daniel I was too busy with work, too tired, not feeling well. He didn't push. A part of him was relieved, I think, that he didn't have to watch his mother and his wife occupy the same air. But avoidance isn't victory. It's just silence stretched thin. And silence, tears eventually. The breaking point came in the most ordinary way. A simple family barbecue at Margaret's garden. No chandeliers this time, no servers in crisp uniforms. Just folding chairs, paper plates, and the smell of smoke. I thought maybe, just maybe, it would be different. Until I noticed it again. The food passed down the line, burgers and corn and salads, laughter spilling across the tablecloths. And when the bowls reached me, they were empty. Every single dish scraped bare before it landed in front of me. It couldn't be an accident. Not twice. Not again. Margaret leaned back in her chair, sipping her lemonade. Her eyes found mine. No words this time, no audience. Just a look that said, "You know your place." That was the moment something hardened inside me. Not anger exactly. Something colder, steadier. A vow written not in rage but in stone. I smiled at her. A real smile, slow and unshaken. And in that smile I knew I had already begun. Because humiliation when swallowed does not dissolve. It waits. It sharpens. Becomes the blade you one day return. That night I wrote in my journal. She thinks I'll always be the empty plate. She doesn't know I've already started setting the table for something else entirely. I didn't storm out of the family. I didn't cut ties overnight. People expect fire when they hear about betrayal, but I chose ice. I decided to stay quiet, to sit back and observe. Because silence, when sharpened, becomes a scalpel. It cuts deeper than shouting ever could. From that day on, I became the watcher. At every gathering, while Margaret performed her role as matriarch, I kept my expression polite, but my mind was a notebook. I noticed how her niece's laughter dimmed whenever Margaret interrupted her. I saw the way her brother-in-law stiffened when she corrected his story mid-sentence, reshaping it to fit her version of reality. I saw the way Daniel shrank when she praised him, because praise from Margaret was always a leash, never a gift. And I noticed something more important: the cracks. Margaret loved control, but control is exhausting. She spread it over too many people like a net cast too wide, always at risk of tearing. Her power wasn't infinite, it was borrowed from the silence of others. Every time the room stayed quiet, she grew stronger. Every time someone swallowed their protest, she fed. But the silence wasn't unanimous. Aunt Clara never bowed her head. She didn't argue often, she chose her battles carefully, but I began to see how Margaret's eyes flashed when Clara spoke up. It was there in those small sparks that I realized. Margaret wasn't untouchable. She could be challenged. He just hated it. Daniel, though, remained a disappointment. I don't say that with bitterness, just truth. I watched my husband flinch when his mother called me a girl with opinions in front of the cousins. I watched him change the subject instead of defending me. Each time he looked at me after, his eyes pleaded, "Don't make me choose." But whether he admitted it or not, the choice was already carved into our lives. He had chosen peace with her over respect for me. And that is a debt that doesn't vanish. So I didn't fight him. Not yet. I let him live in his truce even while I prepared for a war he didn't see coming. One evening, after another tedious dinner where Margaret asked every cousin about their jobs but skipped me entirely, Clara pulled me aside. We stood by the doorway, the smell of roast lingering in the air, voices still echoing in the hall. "She does it on purpose," Clara said, her eyes steady on mine. "But I can tell you're not folding under it. You're studying her." I couldn't help but smile. "You make it sound like I'm plotting." Clara's lips twitched. "Aren't you?" I didn't answer. But she knew. Outside those dinners, my life blossomed in ways Margaret never asked about. My projects at work were succeeding. I was being noticed for leadership. I made new friends who saw me without a filter of judgment. With them I laughed freely, the kind of laughter that comes from being understood. And the more I thrived beyond Margaret's table, the more I realized. Her world was smaller than she believed. She ruled her dining room, yes. But beyond those walls, her throne meant nothing. That gave me an idea. If she could erase me in her domain, I would build my own. One she couldn't touch. At the next family gathering, I tried something new. When the food was served, I didn't wait for her gaze to approve me. I leaned back, smiled at the cousin beside me, and started a conversation about my latest project. At first, people hesitated. It felt strange to speak over Margaret's script. But slowly their shoulders eased, their laughter returned, and I realized something startling. They liked my stories. For the first time, the table bent away from her orbit just slightly toward me. I caught Margaret's eyes across the candles. She was smiling, but it was tight, brittle, the kind of smile that masks fury. And in that instant I understood. The smallest shift in attention was the greatest insult she could suffer. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't fought. I had simply spoken and others had chosen to listen. That was when I knew I was no longer invisible. I was becoming the quiet threat she never expected. That night, Clara pressed my hand before leaving. "Careful, Elana," she whispered. "She doesn't forgive those who steal the spotlight." I smiled, calm and certain. "I'm not stealing it. I'm just reminding them it was never hers to begin with." At home I opened my journal again. This time I didn't just write "be patient." I wrote, "Watch, learn, prepare." Because patience without action is waiting. But patience with intention? That's strategy. And Margaret had no idea I was already playing her game better than she was. After months of watching, I realized Margaret's greatest mistake. She underestimated me. To her, I was still the girl at the table with the empty plate, a silent shadow who would either endure or eventually vanish. But endurance can be alchemy. What she mistook for weakness was simply time hardening into strategy. I didn't confront her head-on. That would have been giving her the battle she wanted, one she could win with authority and spectacle. Instead, I began making quiet moves in the background, steps so subtle they almost looked like nothing at all. The first step was in the family itself. I sought out the people who had been silenced. A cousin who always lowered her voice when Margaret corrected her. An uncle who rarely spoke but whose eyes darted nervously whenever Margaret claimed credit for his ideas. Even Daniel's younger sister, who flinched when her mother dismissed her new career as a phase. I listened. I nodded. I gave them what Margaret never did, attention without conditions. Slowly they began talking to me more at gatherings, leaning toward me instead of shrinking from her. It wasn't rebellion, not yet. But it was a shift. A seed. Margaret noticed, of course. Her glances grew sharper when she caught me laughing with someone, sharper still when Clara openly included me in conversation. But she couldn't stop it without revealing her insecurity, and that was something her pride wouldn't allow. The second step was outside the family. I focused on building my reputation in places Margaret had no control. My career, my community, even charity events she wasn't part of. I accepted speaking opportunities, wrote articles, connected with people who valued what I had to say. Soon I was being invited to functions not because of Margaret's name, but because of mine. And here's the truth. Power outside the family translates into power inside it. At the next dinner, when a relative asked about an article I'd written that was making rounds online, Margaret's smile faltered. She tried to change the subject, but the conversation circled back to me again and again. For once, she wasn't the only star of the table. At home, Daniel struggled with the shifting tide. He wasn't blind, he saw Margaret's irritation growing. But instead of defending me, he retreated into neutrality. "You're provoking her," he warned one night. "Do you want this war?" I looked at him calmly. She declared it the moment she left my plate empty. "I'm just choosing my battlefield." He sighed, rubbed his temples and said nothing more. His silence was no longer disappointing. It was expected. I had stopped counting on him to protect me. I had learned to protect myself. Then came the small but deliberate third step. I hosted. It was subtle at first, just inviting a few relatives to our apartment for coffee, for brunch, for a casual evening. I made sure it was warm, welcoming, effortless. No empty plates, no cutting remarks. People laughed freely, and for the first time, they saw what family could feel like without Margaret orchestrating every detail. Clara, with her perceptive eyes, smiled knowingly one evening as she sipped her tea in my kitchen. "You're building your own table," she said softly. I met her gaze. Yes. And when the time comes, she'll know she's no longer the only one who can host. The cracks widened. At the next family gathering in Margaret's grand dining room, the energy was different. Conversations weren't all aimed at her. People compared my brunches to her dinners. Kindly, politely, but the comparison itself was the wound. Margaret's smile that night was brittle glass. She raised her wine glass in a toast, but her hand trembled just enough for me to notice. And in that tiny tremor I saw it clearly. Her throne was wobbling. That night back home I opened my journal again. Under watch. Learn. Prepare. I added a fourth word. Build. Because revenge is not only about tearing someone down. It's about constructing something so undeniable that they cannot erase you. Margaret had forced me into invisibility. Now I was becoming impossible to ignore. Margaret was never one to admit defeat. The moment she noticed the shift, the conversations leaning toward me, the laughter I sparked, the way family members began asking when I would host again, her smile sharpened into something thinner, harder. The woman who once ignored me now addressed me directly. Not warmly, not kindly, but with a blade hidden in her tone. "Elana," she said at the next dinner, her voice honeyed for the room but sharp for me. "You've been busy, haven't you? All these little gatherings. I do hope you don't wear yourself out trying to impress." I smiled back, calm, unbothered. "Oh, it's no trouble at all. When people feel welcome, they bring their own joy. Hosting becomes easy." A ripple passed through the table. Some stifled grins. Clara's eyes glinted with quiet pride. Margaret's hand tightened on her glass until her knuckles whitened. For the first time, the room had witnessed me answering back, not with anger but with composure. And Margaret hated it. After that night, her attacks grew bolder. Small slights became open jabs. She forgot to include my name in a family group message, then shrugged. "Oh, I assumed Daniel would tell you." She interrupted me mid-story to correct a detail even when I was right. At one gathering, she even announced loudly, "Tradition is important. Some of us were born into this family. Others." She let the pause do the cutting. Each time I responded not with silence but with subtle steel. I never raised my voice. I never broke composure. I smiled, I redirected, I refused to bend. And each time I noticed more eyes turning toward me, not in pity but in respect. The spell of her control was unraveling. But cracks in a throne don't just weaken the ruler, they make her dangerous. Margaret began plotting openly. She told Daniel one afternoon that I was changing him, that I was pulling him away from his roots. He came home shaken, torn between two loyalties, repeating her words like a man who didn't know which belonged to him anymore. I didn't argue with him. I didn't defend myself. I simply said, "Daniel, the question isn't whether I'm changing you. The question is, do you like who you are around me more or who you are around her?" He had no answer. And his silence once again told me enough. The family itself was shifting too. Cousins who once sat stiffly now rolled their eyes when Margaret cut them off. Her brother-in-law joked, "Careful, Margaret might erase you from the dinner list," earning a burst of laughter around the table. Jokes. Those were the first signs of rebellion. Margaret's control wasn't absolute anymore. The fear was thinning. I could see it in her eyes. Panic. She was losing her role as the center. And the more she tried to grip it, the faster it slipped through her fingers. One evening, Clara pulled me aside again. We stood near the kitchen, voices muffled by clinking dishes. "You've changed the air, Elana," she whispered. "They're breathing easier now. But be careful, Margaret won't fall quietly. She will try to humiliate you one last time." I nodded, steady. "Then I'll be ready." Because by then I wasn't just watching or building. I was preparing the stage. That night I added a new word to my journal. Beneath watch. Learn. Prepare. Build. I wrote. Strike. Not with rage. Not with chaos. But with the same weapon she had once used against me. A table, a plate, and silence. I was ready to give her back everything she had served me. Some debts are never settled with words. They are settled with symbols. Quiet, sharp, unforgettable. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and share in the comments. If you had one chance to return every humiliation you ever endured in one gesture, what would you do? The night I chose was deliberate. My birthday. Not because I needed celebration, but because Margaret could never resist a gathering that wasn't about her. She would come, certain she could turn my day into her stage. And for once I welcomed it. I rented a private dining hall. Not opulent like her marble estate, but elegant, warm, and alive with light. I invited everyone. Family, friends, colleagues. Clara sat at my right hand, her smile carrying secrets we both knew. Daniel, nervous as always, hovered at my side, caught between dread and duty. The tables were set with care. Silver polished, candles lit, wine glasses shimmering. And in the center of each setting, a plate. Perfectly placed, perfectly full, except for one. At the head of the table, where I had intentionally seated her, Margaret's place gleamed white and untouched. No entree. No garnish. Just porcelain under the glow of candlelight. A silence fell, familiar and heavy. 23 pairs of eyes shifted, realizing what they were seeing. And then Clara, bless her, asked the question she had asked months ago in Margaret's own house. Why is this plate empty? I stood, unhurried. My hands rested on the back of my chair as I looked directly at Margaret. It isn't a mistake, I said, my voice steady enough to cut the air. It's a reminder. A murmur rippled across the room. Margaret's eyes widened, then narrowed, but she stayed silent. Some time ago, I continued, I sat at a table where everyone was served but me. Where my presence was treated as less than a privilege, as though I had earned nothing. I was told in silence and in words that I knew why. I leaned forward, locking my eyes with hers. Tonight, Margaret, so do you. The air fractured. Forks froze midair. Conversations died before they began. Faces turned pale, not with confusion but with recognition. They remembered. They had witnessed. And now so had she. Margaret's lips parted but no sound came. For the first time, the woman who always had a retort, an excuse, a performance, had nothing. I didn't leave her hanging forever. After a pause sharp enough to sting, I gestured to the servers. They stepped forward, laying down her plate at last, filled and steaming. Respect, I said softly, isn't served to those who demand it. It's served to those who give it. Consider this a lesson, long overdue. The table erupted, not in chaos but in quiet applause. Subtle, restrained, but unmistakable. Clara's hands clapped first, then others followed, until even the cousins Margaret had silenced before joined in. The sound wasn't loud, but it was enough. It was the sound of a crown cracking. Margaret lifted her fork with trembling fingers, but she didn't eat. Her hand shook too much. She set it down and stared at me, a war raging in her eyes. But wars need armies, and in that moment hers had vanished. Afterward, people came to me, not her. They praised the meal, the warmth, the ease of the night. They asked when I would host again. They laughed freely without looking over their shoulders for her approval. Daniel stayed quiet, torn as ever, but when we were alone, he finally whispered, "You changed something tonight." "No," I told him with the calm certainty of a woman who had waited too long for this moment. "She did. I just showed her what it feels like." Later, when the hall was empty and the candles burned low, I walked past Margaret's abandoned plate. The food sat untouched, cooling, forgotten. Just like mine had been months ago. I looked at it and smiled. Because sometimes revenge doesn't need shouting or destruction. Sometimes all it needs is a mirror. And tonight, Margaret had finally seen her reflection.